Vishnupad Paramahansa Varibrajacharya Ashtatarasi Srimad Divine Grace Abhay Charanad with Bhaktisiddhanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahansa Varibrajacharya Ashtatarasi Srimad Divine Grace Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the sum of devotees. All glories to the sum of devotees. All glories to the sum of devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Nama Om Vishnu Badaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvisesha Shunyavadi Paschatare Shatarine. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai. So today we have the great honor and fortune to say a few things about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj Prabhupada. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj, when he appeared, that was February 6, 1874, and appeared as Bimal Prasad, one of the sons of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And as we were discussing some days back, he is in the line of Narottam Das Thakur. And in the Datta heritage, you could say. The Dattas, as we explained earlier, were a very prominent family in Bengal, and were very devotional, as well as very affluent, very well-to-do Kayastha family. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's lineage is quite extraordinary. That his predecessors were such great personalities as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Narottam Das Thakur, Krishnananda Datta was a very pious king in Bengal. So, no doubt, a very wonderful lineage. And that was quite evident from his very birth. When he was only some 5 months old, he was given the special mercy of Lord Jagannath. During the Rath Yatra festival, when Jagannath's garland fell down onto his person, his mother had taken him out because the cart had stopped on Grand Road, right there in front of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's house, and stayed there for some days, mysteriously. Stayed there for some days. And finally the mother took out little Bimal and for darshan, and Jagannath's garland fell down on the child. So right from the beginning he was very special, you could say, extraordinary. And Even that was declared in his astrological chart. Interesting to note that later on in his life, astrology, or at least in his early years up until his college days, astrology was a very important or very instrumental, a prominent thing in his studies. As a result, he was given that name, Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati, because he became so learned in astrology that he was given those titles when he was just a teenager. But in his chart, it's described that this person would be very prominent in the restoration of the mission of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, that he would become a very great preacher. And as we were mentioning the other day, even Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur benedicted him, that his words would be very powerful. And that was actually exemplified in his life, throughout his whole life, that he was such a forceful preacher that shortly after he was given this wonderful mantra, Nrsingadev mantra, he was initiated into the chanting of the holy names in a regulated fashion by his father when he was just a young boy, 7 or 8 years old. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur initiated him into the Nrsinga mantra. And from that time on, he became very, very powerful in his devotional activities. Even as a small child, as a young boy, at the age of 8 or 9 years old, he began to compose Sanskrit verses. He was so endowed by Krishna's mercy. Then later on given this title of Nrsinga Guru, because he was so powerful in his preaching that it's described that you could barely look into straight into his face. He was so powerful. Just by looking into him, persons would feel shuddered. They would feel intimidated or humbled. While at the same time, he himself was also a very humble personality. Although he was very forceful in his preaching, whenever he would greet someone, he would always say, "Adasosmi," that I'm your servant. Not that he was in some way trying to establish himself, but immediately his mood would be that I'm your servant. So after his initiation of the Nrsinga mantra, one interesting thing happened in his life, and that was that in the construction of the Calcutta residence, one Kurma deity, a deity was unearthed. And this deity, a Kurma deity, is very significant because it's the deity of Adbhuta Ras, or the mellow, or that rasa which increases or makes other rasas wonderful. And this is significant because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also exhibited that rasa is best exemplified in the personality of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. That whenever Chaitanya Mahaprabhu would exhibit certain mellows, they would become wonderful. They would increase. And when he was feeling his highest ecstasies, he would take on that form of kurma. Very fascinating. So this kurma was also a very prominent feature of his devotional life. And played an important role throughout his preaching. He established various ashrams, and that Kurma deity was a very prominent feature in many of those ashrams. So clearly he was not some ordinary personality, some ordinary devotee. And exemplified that from a very early age. Again, being able to recite and compose various verses and songs even at an early age. One interesting encounter that was there between one popular or famous sadhu and Bhaktivinoda Thakur was that why didn't this child offer obeisances when he greeted me? Typically you see that, right? When when you're in the presence of some sadhu, you offer your respects. But so this sadhu, he questioned, why isn't it that this boy, he doesn't offer obeisances? And Bhaktivinoda Thakur responded that, he doesn't offer obeisances to sahajiyas. That was immediately established where that person was. And again, where even Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was, a very advanced soul, you can see, just even at an early age. And this he exhibited even in his daily activities, that he was not so interested in playing games and sports as you typically find in those early days. Instead, he was more interested in discussing and hearing about the pastimes of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as was Narottam Das Thakur. It was very fascinating how these great souls, they don't happen very often, but it's interesting to note their lives and their activities. From the very beginning, they're very exceptional in their devotional activities and their intent. He also had a excellent memory, Shruti Dhara, that he could remember what he had heard later on in his life. He could remember what he had discussed with a certain person even 50 years earlier. When we're having trouble remembering what happened last month or last week or maybe even yesterday, he was remembering verbatim what he had been discussing with someone some 50 years earlier. Very fascinating. So in this way he gradually grew, and as a young teenager began to again develop a lot of these devotional tendencies. When he was 18 years old, he began to follow Chaturmasya, and those who may be familiar with Chaturmasya is a very austere period, 4 months of the year, when you abstain from certain foods, you only eat at a certain time, you only eat so much, you neglect a lot of your bodily demands. You're stationed in one particular place, there's no traveling. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also showed this in his pastimes when we reached Chaitanya Charitamrita. He was in South India for that Chaturmasya period, which was very significant in the preaching of the Krishna consciousness movement. So even at an early age, he also started following Chaturmasya. But still, all the while he was being educated, his father, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur, wanted him to have a secular education so that he would be able to preach to the greater society. And that actually was exhibited later on in his life, that he was, not since the time of Srinivas Acharya and Shamananda and Narottam had anyone traveled all around India extensively preaching. Not since that time. So at a very early period in his life, he would accompany Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in his travels, and would make note of how Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur was preaching. He would learn his the various press activities that had to be there in publications. All of these things he learned from Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and learned the finer principles of devotional life. At the age of 21, while he was still in college, he got into a disagreement with the principal that he was attending, the college that he was attending, and decided that he would give up schooling. He quit, which was unheard of in those days. In those days, to leave school was considered very irresponsible and looked down upon. It was an honor to get to school, even, what to speak of quitting. But he decided that if I continue with my education, then I'll be brow beaten to accept Grihastha life. And therefore, I'll quit school and act as a fool, be considered a fool, and in that way I'll be able to avoid that whole troublesome part of life. So in this way he was able to leave school and devote his time, full time, to assisting Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur in his preaching work. Meeting Srila Gaurkishore Das Babaji Maharaj when he was 25 years old, and at that time he took initiation, and was questioned afterwards, why is it that your activities, because Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was a very active traveling preacher, why is it that you took initiation from this Gaurkishore Das Babaji, who was a stationary Babaji someplace in Navadvip? Why is it that you're taking initiation from him? That doesn't sound right. There's some conflict there, seeming difference. There's a very nice story. There's a very nice, I don't remember all the details of it, but he described basically how there was no difference in their missions. That although he was silent, he was actually the energy or the force behind Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's activities, his preaching. Just as in a boat, there may be so many sounds. How was the example given? I'm trying to remember. That there's so many sounds in the boat, but behind the boat there's the motor, which is propelling that boat to do its work. So also, although Srila Gorkashadas Babaji Maharaj was not a prominent figure, he was the force, he was the motor or the strength or the impetus for his devotional life. It was a very interesting comparison or answer that he gave. When he was 31 years old, it's described, he decided to take on this vow of chanting 1 billion names of the Lord, which means practically 170 or something like that, 170 rounds per day, 180 rounds per day. And that went on for some 7-8 years. And fulfill that vow. Quite remarkable. Shortly after that austerity that he had been engaged in, his predecessor teachers, or his instrumental teachers, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Gaura Das Babaji Maharaj, they both disappeared. They left this mortal world. And with all sorts of opposition, and in their absence, he was feeling sort of discouraged, and decided that he would remove himself from public activities and preaching activities, because prior to that he again been traveling quite extensively, but decided after their disappearance that I'm going to step back. But then he had a dream in which Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Lord Nityananda, the 6 Goswamis, and so many other great saints appeared and told him, no, that we're behind you. We're in full support of you. You need to continue this preaching work. So the next day when he woke, he was completely invigorated, and again continued his vigorous preaching. And there's an interesting description of how one of the main canons of his preaching life was that everything should be done for Krishna. Everything should be done for Krishna. Whenever he would get into discussions with certain dignitaries, whenever he would be preaching to his disciples, or he would be holding public functions, that was his main thrust, always, that everything should be done for Krishna. And that although he was very forceful in that way, still he was always very humble. There's a very nice incident in which some devotees were questioning, if I can remember exactly where that was. There's a very nice story in which he has an exchange with some various politicians. He would, again, looking from the angle that everything should be used and directed toward serving the Lord. He had one meeting with the governor of Bengal, and at this meeting, he ordered that whatever foods are there for their British tastes should be made available. So in other words, meat was brought to the conference and was served. And on another occasion, he arranged for cigarettes to be made available for a dignitary from an ambassador or something like that from Germany. But he would always go back to this point that whatever is necessary for the preaching, that should be done. But although he was liberal in that way, still he was himself very strict and uncompromising. One teacher petitioned that we're very fallen. He was speaking to one group of students, and the teacher questioned that we're very fallen. We've fallen into a very nightmarish state. And you speak of all of these high matters. Can you give us an easier process? And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta responded that you've fallen into the well, and I shall not go down. Instead, you come up. You raise your hand, and I'll grab your hand, and I'll pull you up. In other words, we don't compromise our own standards. But in order to help the conditioned souls, certain things have to be adjusted. But at the same time, he would state that we cannot give up our essential practices. But at the same time, again, he was very careful with his yukta vairagya, his renunciation, that we have to do whatever is necessary in order to serve Krishna. And he would state that don't scrimp or go in a lowly manner. Because sometimes out of some false renunciation, we may think that, well, I don't need this, or I don't need that, or we shouldn't have certain facilities, we should be more renounced, etc. As many of his critics would sometimes criticize him, that you're not orthodox enough, or orthodox enough, or you're out of the tradition. But he would brush all of that criticism aside, and again he would always bring up this saying that everything should be done for Krishna. So certain adjustments would sometimes have to be made. And in that way, he was a revolutionary in his preaching. It's described that his ashrams would have cars, they would have camels and elephants and horses. As a matter of fact, his horses were sometimes, some of the rumor was that the horses were so strong and powerful because they were being fed malpur. Whatever. They were being fed so opulently that that's why they were so strong. In so many ways, they were criticizing him for various standards that he was implementing in his preaching work. And even sometimes his disciples would question, well, if we do something like this, we may be criticized. Because Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was suggesting that we should also implement some of these standards in our foreign preaching. And one person commented that, well, it will be criticized for all of these out of the tradition activities. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's response was that I decided all of these things thousands of births ago. He'd already thought of these preaching tools long before. And therefore concluded that this was necessary for practicing and spreading Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission. Later on in his life, there's some very interesting stories about how he would interact with various dignitaries and some of his little stories that he would use as a preaching angle. And one story was the story of the wise old monkey. A very interesting story in which in this fable, there was a king who had many sons. And in order to satisfy his sons, he ordered the guards to go out and capture this family of monkeys. And so this family was captured and brought to the palace. And in this way, the boys were entertained with monkeys. They could play and feed the monkeys and sport around. So the king was very conscious of having a comfortable setting for his children. He would have other animals come, also goats, and they would freely walk throughout the palace and the grounds. But there was, in the monkey family, there was an old monkey, the grandfather, you could say, grandfather monkey, who one day walked into the kitchen, and he noticed there was this one goat who was coming into the kitchen, and he would start devouring different items that were being prepared in the kitchen. And the cooks got really angry, and they would throw things at him, or they would beat him, and he would leave. But again, the goat would come back 2-3 times in a day. And the monkey was observing this, and after this happened repeatedly, it dawned on him, the monkey, that this goat, if we stay here, this goat will be the death of us. And he was reasoning within his mind that one of these days, when this goat comes in, he's going to go over to where all the foods are being prepped, and the cooks are going to see this. They're going to reach for something to beat him away, and they'll grab something from the fire, a stick from the fire, they'll beat him, and he'll catch his coat on fire. He'll run into the stables and roll around in the straw to put out the fire. It'll cause the stables to get on fire, and the stables will burn down, and the horses that are inside, some will die, and those that are saved, the king will be totally distraught, of course, because the horses are his favorite. And he'll call for the veterinarians, and the veterinarians will come, and he'll ask them, well, what can I do to save these horses? And the veterinarian will say, well, the only thing that will save your horses is monkey fat. So he reasoned that this will be the death of us. We have to get out of here. So he rushed back to his family and told them that we need to get out of here. This is very critical. We could be all dead very shortly. We need to pack up and get out of the palace immediately. But the other monkeys were saying, "Oh, you old man, you old monkey, you don't know anything, and you should just sit and be quiet." But he persisted. He said, "No, we have to leave. This is going to be the death of us. If we stay here, this will happen, and this and that." And finally, they got so angry they told him to get out. So with a heavy heart, he left, because he couldn't bear to sit there and see his whole family extinguished, basically. So he left and went off into the jungle. Sometime after that, lo and behold, this goat, this rascal goat, this particular goat, had it to go into the kitchen, and he began to devour all the foods that were being prepared. And one of the cooks came in and saw it, and they became so enraged. They were looking for something to scare him away, and they grabbed a stick from the fire and beat him. And the goat's coat got on fire. He ran into the stables. He started rolling around in the stables, trying to put out the fire. The stables caught on fire and burned down. And the horses that were inside, a few escaped, but were badly injured. The rest were all killed. So the king, what did he do? He called for his veterinarians, and what can I do? Well, the only thing we can do is we can go by what the great veterinarian doctor Salihotra, what was his name? Salihotra. We can go by what he's recommended, and he's recommended monkey fat. So the king said, "So be it. Get all these monkeys." So they went out and they rounded up the whole monkey family, and they were finished. After some time later, the old monkey in the forest, in the jungle, when he heard what had happened, all he could do was lament with a heavy heart. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta commented on this little story by saying that disciples who follow the guru should uh, those who shun bad association will be benefited. Right? We know that verse from Chaitanya Charitamrita, Asat Sangya Tag E Vaishnava Chara. We try to avoid bad association. So the disciple who follows the guru should avoid bad association, and in that way will be benefited. But those who consider the guru senile, he's an old man, what can he teach us? We've heard so much, I know just as much, I probably even know more. They will be casualties of asatsang. They'll be casualties of such bad association. And observing these tendencies in the sishyas, when the guru sees that this is the tendency of the disciples, and unable to bear it, unable to bear witness to their destruction, he departs. So it was very important instruction that he gave right at the end of his physical presence in this world. Is a very interesting instruction. We've heard also that there was some dissatisfaction with some of his followers. They had become more interested in living a good life. Just like the monkeys. They said, oh, no, we can't. You want us to go out and eat leaves and sleep in the trees? No way. We can't do that. We're being fed by the princes nice cooked food, and it's served with such nice spices and sweets. The boys would feed the monkeys all of these different items. We know how monkeys like sweets. Actually, one time I was in Vrindavan with my daughter. We were walking through Loy Bazaar, and as we were walking, she was just about so tall. A monkey jumped down on her shoulder, and she had a bag that had sweets in it. And the monkey jumped on her shoulders, and they were having a tug of war for a while, until finally the monkey let loose and left. So they like sweets. So anyway, these are just a small smidget of information about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. He was such an incredible personality. So we'll end there. Are there any questions or comments? Maharaj? He was that's a quite a long story. He had approached Gaura Das Babaji Maharaj numerous times and was rebuffed. Maharaj, Srila Gaura Das Babaji Maharaj was denied him some 3 or 4 times. Each time saying that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had not appeared to him yet to give him approval. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appears and tells me so, then I will accept you as a disciple. Until finally, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta threatened to take his own life, jumping off a bridge, and then Gaura Das Babaji Maharaj relented. That's in a nutshell. But he was such an incredible personality. On many occasions, he would go off in the night by himself, and his followers would hear him speaking to somebody out there, and then they would follow him out there, and there's no one there. They would question him, who are you speaking to? Or he would say, do you see them? He would point to, there's Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, there's Lord Nityananda. There's the Goswamis. Of course, he was having a transcendental vision. Any other comments or pastimes? There's a lot. There's so much you can't even touch it. There's so much nectar about his preaching and his activities and how he was so forceful in spreading Krishna consciousness. Yes, Prabhu. Hmm. Many people would come and try to touch his feet, though, and he refused. He wouldn't even let his disciples touch his feet. He was always very distant in that way. Jai. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj Prabhupada ki jai. Visiting the temple residence, probably some